Welcome back to episode 2 of the second series of Miller's Movers, where we look at the jump scene in general, really, but particularly focusing on the horses moving in the handicaps. We're going to have some horses to follow and just try and keep abreast of what's happening in the jump racing scene, with a particular focus on the race that happen day to day, weekend to weekend, not just jumping ahead, getting ahead of ourselves, focusing just on Cheltenham. This weekend was a bit of a lull. I'm not a big fan of it. They get all excited with Chepstow and then Foss last, and then it's quite a quiet week. And then just this weekend, just the racing from Kempton on Sunday of real note. But I did think there was one performance there that was worth talking about, and that was the win of Rubo, winning that listed hurdle for the second time. It's clearly an effective horse right-handed, clearly an effective horse around Kempton. I opposed him. I thought maybe, given that Paul Nicholls had been slightly slow to hit gear, he might be worth opposing this year under a slightly bigger weight, but he won the race with a great degree of comfort. He jumps very nicely. Harry Cobden clearly gets on very well with him, and he had the race won, jumping the second last. Nice jump over the last and scooted clear. I thought it was a very good performance indeed. They've hinted at the fact they think he's probably just below top class over hurdles. They're going to look at going novice chasing. And I've seen a few sort of suggest that might be a poor move by former champion trainer Paul Nicholls. I disagree. I think Rubo jumps hurdles very accurately. He clearly thinks about what he's doing. He seems to bend his back, use his back. He's not overly low over his hurdles. And of course, you've got to remember that we constantly see really good footage coming out of Ditchit of these horses schooling around the outdoor arena over mini fences. So he's certainly going to have seen fences at home, even if he hasn't seen them on the track. I think he's got the technique that will lend itself to chasing. Whether he improves on his hurdle mark, I'm not so sure, but he might not need to make hay in the novice chase division, certainly in the UK in the early part of the year. So Rubo, I think, will go novice chasing, and I certainly wouldn't be against that as a move to perhaps see him bag a few more wins this season. So we'll start this episode by looking at my Irish horses to follow for the season. I've got 8 of them, and we'll start with 2 novice hurdlers. The first of which is the Yellow Clay for Gordon Elliott. Has plenty of experience in bumpers and ran at all the big festivals last year. Was 4th at the Dublin Racing Festival, when actually I thought was probably a shade unlucky. He travelled nicely into the race, ran into traffic on the bend at Leopardstown, had to get snatched up, but made really good progress into the finishing straight, eventually finished 4th. And when you watch Leopardstown races, if they get stopped on the bend up that hill turning in, and it is a very stiff hill, it's deceptive on TV, you sort of have to get to Leopardstown to see it. Very few horses, if they get stopped at that point in the race, are able to pick up and run home, and he certainly did. So I thought that was a run that was worthy of an upgrade. He then went to Cheltenham and perhaps raced a little bit keen through the early stages there. He was posted quite wide, didn't have an awful lot of cover, perhaps did a bit too much, because when I was expecting him to finish strongly up the hill, he slightly wilted, weakened into 6th. It was still a decent run. I'm not quite sure as to the level of form that the Cheltenham bumper is going to show this year, but it was a decent run nevertheless, some good experience of the track. And he then came back and went to Punchestown and ran, I thought, probably a career best, finishing 2nd behind Redemption Day, who has had plenty of experience in bumpers. I think it's his 3rd season trying bumpers. He's a very good horse on quicker ground. I don't think the Yellow Clay, being by Yates, is going to want fast ground necessarily, and he just plugged on and stayed at the same pace, whereas Redemption Day was able to quicken up and go past him. But nevertheless, I thought it was a really strong run. He's clearly a tough horse. He's a horse that's going to stay very well. Probably have the class to win a maiden over 2 miles, but I would expect Gordon Elliott to step him up in trip through the season. And of course, if they're going to want to go for a handicap later in the season at the Cheltenham Festival, they're going to have to get plenty of runs into these horses to get a mark to be eligible to go there. So it might well be that we see these novices a bit more regularly in Ireland this year. And the Yellow Clay, I think, has got a good constitution. He showed that with his bumper form. And so I expect him to rack up a sequence in novice hurdles. The second novice hurdler I want to mention is William Munny for trainer Barry Connell. Barry Connell had a very quiet year last year, struggled to get his horses healthy from sort of pretty much November onwards. But William Munny ran well in 2 bumpers at Navan and at Naas. The form of the first at Navan hasn't really been frank. Sato Chance didn't run all that well on his next chance start, and he finished 2nd behind William Munny. The Naas form, again, the runner-up hasn't done much for that, but the 3rd place Wingman has since won at the Punchestown Festival And I thought that William Munny showed a really good change of gear at Naas. He quickened up very smartly. He then missed the Cheltenham Festival. He was last seen at the Punchestown Festival, finishing third behind Redemption Day and the Yellow Clay. But they went quite slow through the early part of that race. He was situated a long way back, had to navigate plenty of traffic to get into a challenging position, and really the first two had gone by the time he was able to hit top gear. But again, he showed a smart turn of foot, stayed on quite nicely in the closing stages, and he might just be a horse that's gone under the radar of a few, given that he didn't go to the Cheltenham Festival in the spring. So William Munny for Barry Connell. Again, I think Barry Connell's been keen to try and have a good year this year. I think he'll get his horses out early, run them plenty, and I think William Munny can be a horse that will win plenty in novice hurdles, certainly in Ireland in the early part of the year. Moving on to a couple of handicappers to follow now, the first of which is Built by Ballymore for trainer Martin Brazil. I wouldn't often be a layer, and I certainly wouldn't be a very regular layer at the Cheltenham Festival, but I did lay this horse when he was well punted in the Coral Cup last season. I'd watched him a good few times in Ireland when winning at Punchestown. To me, he just looked a slow, lazy horse that was essentially requiring heavy ground. The ground was soft in the Coral Cup, but I was pretty adamant that he wouldn't have the tactical speed for that race, and I think it was proven right. He was a long way back, struggled to get a position, and JJ Slevin made a big move mid-race coming round the field to try and get into a challenging position. But from there, he couldn't really sustain his effort and he weakened quite dramatically. He then went just 2 weeks later to Fairyhouse and ran very disappointingly when pulling up, but the vet's notes report that he took a long time to recover, a delayed recovery there. So clearly all wasn't well. And it's possible that that was perhaps, just 2 weeks on from Cheltenham coming too soon. He's been dropped from a mark of 139 down to a mark of 134. I don't think he's a horse for the UK. I think he's going to be best on desperate Irish winter ground. 2 mile 4, he'll stay a little bit further. They might well go over fences with him, where perhaps jumping fences will mean that the field won't get away from him so much. He's certainly a horse that takes a bit of riding, but he's a very talented horse. He stays very well. And I think off a mark of 134, he's got plenty of options going forward, certainly in Ireland in the early part and mid part of the winter. It's very difficult when compiling these lists, hard as I tried, to stay away from Willie Mullins trained horses. And the first I want to mention is Shanbally Kid. He was impressive. He actually beat Monty Starr when winning a maiden hurdle on his second attempt in May 2023. But pretty much little has gone right in 4 runs since then. He returned last season and made his chase debut, where he jumped poorly on heavy ground, eventually finishing 4th. And he was then switched back to hurdles. He ran over 3 miles at the Dublin Racing Festival, where to my mind he didn't appear to stay that trip. And then he ran very well, finishing 3rd at Cheltenham in the Coral Cup, where, again, over that 2 mile 5 furlong trip, I just don't think he quite saw it out. He was going to be a good second and just close to the line, weakened, got collared for that, eventually finished 3rd. But he's down to a mark of 135. I think that's a very workable mark. He's not yet really raced on sound surfaces. One race on sound surfaces when with Richard O'Brien, when he won his bumper from where Gigginstown perched him, and he looked wickedly impressive on that occasion. By presenting, they do tend to like a sound surface. I'd be really interested to see this horse in the early part of the season off a mark of 135, probably over hurdles, but I wouldn't be against him if he went back over fences. His one chase debut, he did jump poorly, but that was on heavy ground, which I don't think he likes at all, and that can, of course, compromise their jumping. So the Shanbally Kid, off a mark of 135, that would be quite a low rating for a Willie Mullins Gigginstown inmate, and I'm sure that over 2 miles 4, there's races to be won with him. And then on to another Willie Mullins trained horse, which is Jit Langy for JP McManus. He was wickedly impressive when coming across to Ireland, making his debut, winning at Tipperary. He's only been seen once since. He's perhaps been a little bit difficult to train. That came when running in the Grade 1 novice hurdle at the Dublin Racing Festival. He finished 5th, beaten 18 lengths behind Ballymore, but he was given a very eye-catching ride. He was held up at the back of the field, clearly looked like an educational run, and he made really nice progress under far from vigorous riding up the home straight. Certainly suggested that he was a horse that had a future. He's got a mark of 138. He wasn't then seen in the spring, but he's going to return with that mark. Slightly light on experience, but he did have 2 runs in France. He clearly likes a sound surface, so I'd be surprised if they didn't get him out quite early. Might well be a horse that comes across to the UK as well. Willie Mullins earlier this week has signalled his intention to try and spread his plethora of horses across both the UK and Ireland, which spells trouble, I suspect, for UK trainers. But Jit Langy, given that he likes a sounder surface and the ground in the spring tends to be, in the autumn I should say, tends to be better over here than it is in Ireland, I wouldn't be surprised to see Jit Langy over this way at some point. A mark of 138, I suggest, underestimates his ability, and I'm sure he'll be winning plenty of races in the early part of the season. And the final handicapper I want to talk about is Fenway Park for Gavin Cromwell, son of Malinus, who's a stallion I really like. I think they're underestimated as stock in general. He's progressed with each of his 5 starts over hurdles, 4 completed starts. He did pull up on his 3rd start, but he finished lame, so you can comfortably put a line through that run. He progressed each time, progressed with stepping up in trip, and won his final start at Punchestown. That was at odds on. It wasn't a deep race, but he did it very nicely. He's looked to mature, and I do think Malinus stock tend to take a bit of time to come to themselves. Fenway Park, I think, is a horse that Gavin Cromwell, the type of horse he does very well with. He's going to enter handicaps off a fairly low handicap mark. I think he'll progress with time. He's probably a chaser in the making, but he's a horse that I expect to be winning plenty of races in Ireland this season. And then finally, I have a novice chaser and an open horse to follow, both from Willie Mullins. He's very difficult to get away from, but I've tried to steer away from his headline horses. The first is Quai De Bourbon. He's won 3 of his 4 starts since arriving in Ireland from France. His only defeat came in the Martin Pipe conditional jockeys race at the Cheltenham Festival, where I thought he did very little wrong. He travelled beautifully through the race, jumped very soundly, got perhaps outsped up the hill, but he stuck to his task really well and finished a very good 3rd. He was then showed a good constitution to back up. He went to Ayr as part of that sort of army that Willie Mullins sent across to sew up the British trainers title. He won at odds on at Ayr, but he did it very nicely. Again, jumped soundly on slightly quicker ground than he'd faced before. He quickened up smartly up the home straight. He's got a mark of 145. He's by a stallion called Ivanhoe, who's a German-bred stallion I'm particularly excited about. I think he's going to be a good source of staying chasers of the future. I think that's where Quai De Bourbon's future lies, over fences. And if he takes to fences, which plenty of Willie Mullins do, particularly the stamina-bred type horses, I think Quai De Bourbon got an official mark of 145. He could well improve on that, upwards of £10. And if he does, I expect him to be contesting graded races in the spring over fences. He's a horse with Gigginstown. Willie Mullins back on board with them, and I think he's a horse that should be followed in every single race this season. And finally, my open horse to follow for the season in Ireland is Hunter's Yarn, again with Willie Mullins in the double green of Isaac Swade and Simon Munier. He took his form to another level over fences last season. He was going to bolt up on his chase debut at Fairyhouse. He was 5 lengths clear when coming down at the last, but he went back to that track, made no mistakes second time out, absolutely hosed up by 10 lengths from Path Through, who's a decent horse in his own right. I quietly fancied him for the Arkle Chase at Cheltenham, but Darrell Jacob took over in the saddle from Paul Townend, who'd rode him twice in Ireland, and to be honest, gave him a pretty negative ride from the outset. He was held up out the back. He made a mistake at the first, was then taken back even further and made another mistake at the 4th, and from there on his race was over. But he did make quite nice progress up the home straight, despite being hampered by the fall at the last, and he was probably closer at the finish than he was at any other point during the race, despite not really being ridden out to the full extent. Willie Mullins, of course, has got plenty of 2-mile chasers, so he's going to have to spread them out. I think there's no reason why Hunter's Yarn won't stay a little bit further than 2 miles, maybe even 2 mile 4. There's plenty of grade 3, grade 2 chases in Ireland. I'd expect him to mop up a good few of those. It might well be that he's sent over to the UK as well, given that he copes with a sound surface. And Hunter's Yarn is a horse I still think has got plenty yet to give, particularly if Paul Tannen's in the saddle. He's got on with him particularly well. I didn't think Darrell Jacob did a great job at Cheltenham, so Paul Tannen would be a big bonus for me if he pairs up with Hunter's Yarn. But regardless, I think Hunter's Yarn is a horse that can win plenty of races, perhaps away from grade 1 level through the season. So those are my Irish horses to follow for the season, but we'll now move on to the handicap movers and shakers from the last 7 days, the here and now. And the first one I want to speak about is Lump Sum for trainer Sam Thomas. He won the Welsh Champion Hurdle the Sunday before last and did so in really good fashion. He travelled very powerfully through the race, jumped very slickly, probably travelled a bit too well and got Dylan Johnston to the front probably sooner than he would have liked. And I think it was only that saw the winning margin just a length at the line. I think Lump Sum, a fairly young horse, idled up the home straight once getting there and probably was valued for more than the winning margin. I would suggest that while there's progress to come off this mark of 141, given that he's a young horse, he was probably pretty tuned up for that Welsh Champion Hurdle. His trainer, Di Walters, obviously has a great affinity with the Foss Lass racecourse, and so I think this would be pretty much an early season target. So there might not be much improvement to come in fitness, but given he's a young horse, I think going into a better race, given how well he travels, there's probably still a bit more room for improvement in just his raw ability. But the one thing I would point out is Dylan Johnston is retained jockey now for Di Walters. He claimed 5 at Foss Lass As he racks up the winners, his claim is going to come down. That's essentially going to mean that lump sum and horses associated with Daiwalkers are going to be racing off higher handicap marks as the claim becomes reduced. So that's something worth bearing in mind. But I think on the bare face of it, into a better race where a higher calibre of horse will carry him deeper into the race, and as Dylan Johnston learns about these horses, perhaps rides with a bit more patience, I think lump sum can still defy this mark of 141. The next horse I want to talk about is the JP McManus owned Josh Guerrero, Oliver Greenall trained Jagwar. He won his chase debut at Wetherby. He's gone up £5 from a mark of 118 to a mark of 123. He was probably a bit disappointing last seen over hurdles. He was runner-up on his hurdle debut at Aintree, where he got very close to In the Waterside, who's now rated in the 130s. But Jagwar failed to go on from there, but he looked a useful recruit to chasing. He jumped soundly in the main once he got into a rhythm. He was found a little bit of trouble, I felt, by John O'Neill early on. He made some fiddly mistakes in the first couple of fences and had to work, I thought, quite hard to get to the front and then powered away in the closing stages. I saw sort of mixed reviews on social media as to whether it was a good ride or a lucky win, really. Some felt it was a brilliant ride to deliver him late. I personally thought on a novice that John O'Neill found himself in plenty of traffic, and the horse would probably value for more than the winning margin, given he had to work quite hard to get into a challenging position. The ground was only good to soft at Wetherby. I think Jagwar's a horse that's going to appreciate more cut underfoot. So as he goes into the winter and the ground gets softer, that's certainly going to help him. And I think he'll undoubtedly stay further than the 2 mile, 4 furlong trip at Wetherby as well. So a mark of 123, I'd be very surprised if Jagwar couldn't win off that mark on his next start and then progress into deeper company from there. And then one more horse that has gone up in the handicap that I think is of interest, and that's the Kim Bailey trained Hurlerontheditch. Kim Bailey enjoyed a really good day last Wednesday, having a treble down at Worcester. Hurlerontheditch ran up at Wetherby, was probably the one that got away. He was partnered by Brian Hughes for the first time, and off a fairly lenient mark of 112. I thought he would take all the beating. He travelled beautifully through the race at Wetherby. He's a strong stay. He's got form at 3 miles. This was a race over 2 miles 5, and I was slightly surprised to see Brian Hughes almost take a little bit of a pull going to 2 out, sat up, felt he had the race in the bag, and Hurlerontheditch is a sort of grinder and a stayer. Didn't really have an answer to a fast finishing rival. Got touched off very narrowly to finish second. I didn't think it was the finest ride Brian Hughes ever given a horse. I certainly know that was the sentiments shared by connections afterwards. He's only gone up £1 in the weight, so that's perhaps some solace, because it was reasonable he could have gone up a bit further than that. He's got a mark of 113. I think that's definitely a winning mark for Hurlerontheditch. He likes soft ground. He'll stay further than 2 mile 5. 3 miles would be no problem whatsoever. But I would just caveat this by saying that his form did tail off last year after his first start. Now, his first start last year, he took a fairly heavy fall at the last fence at Warwick when looking like bolting up off a mark of 112. On that occasion, he got a £10 rise up to 122. So that gives you some indication as to the ability of the horse. If it was the fall that saw his form tail off last year, then this mark of 113 should be very little trouble indeed to this horse. I'm going to follow him next start. He might well be my cliff horse for 2024, 2025, but I think this current mark is more than workable. And if given a more aggressive ride over 2 mile 5 or a patient ride over 3 miles, I think Hurlerontheditch is a horse that's definitely worth following. Horses going down in the handicap now, and the first I want to talk about is a fairly low-grade horse, but we shouldn't dismiss those. There's some really competitive races in the low grades throughout the week, and the horse in question is Henry Box Brown. He was a really eye-catching winner on his penultimate start. Off a mark of 82, he flew home from out the clouds at Worcester over a trip of 2 mile 4. Ran past tiring horses, but was nevertheless a fairly impressive winner. He got a £9 rise for that win from 82 up to 91. And Ellis Collier, young conditional who rode him at Worcester, rode him again at Hereford on his latest start and tried to repeat the feat, really, give him a very patient ride, gave him far too much to do. And frankly, Hereford with a shorter run in a very different track to Worcester, the field were never going to come back to him. And despite making good late progress, he could never really get into a challenging position and was beaten some distance. But he did run on very strongly, having been given far too much to do. And I thought rather generally the handicapper has given them £1 back down to a mark of 90. Certainly don't think there's any evidence to suggest that it was the handicap mark alone that saw him beaten at Hereford. I'd be keen to follow this horse. I think he'll stay further. 3 miles would certainly make him of interest, and particularly on a perhaps more galloping track than Hereford. So Henry Box Brown, off a mark now of 90, having been dropped £1, is certainly a horse that should stay in your tracker. And then finally, one more horse that's dropping in the handicap. And if you only take one horse from Handicap Movers and Shakers this week, I'd urge you to make it this one. It's Grey Diamond for Donald McCain. He's now a 10-year-old, but he's been dropped £11 in just 3 runs since returning to the UK into the care of Donald McCain, having spent a season with Gordon Elliott. He was previously with Sam Thomas, where he had some really good form, winning off a mark of 135 on soft ground. Now, in his 3 starts, Donald McCain, I don't think he's been disgraced on any of them. He penultimate start at Cal, so he ran perfectly well. He ran into a little bit of trouble on the home bend. And then at Wetherby on his latest start, I thought he shaped with great degree of promise. He was staying on quite nicely behind Primoz, who was a novice making his debut, probably a very well handicapped horse going chasing, was just staying on in the closing stages when he got hampered by a faller at the second last. That took away his momentum. Fergus Gillard, who was on top at the time, wasn't overly hard on him from there on in, and he was beaten, but he's come down another £3. He's now onto a mark of 124, a drop of £11 in just 3 runs. I think is a fairly sizable drop, and I certainly think there's still signs that the fires burn bright with this horse. The ground at Wetherby was good to soft. He's definitely a horse that's better on slower ground. I think he's now on a mark that he can win off, and I'll be really interested to see where Donald McCain targets this horse next. Certainly, I think they'll be looking for a little bit of soft ground. I would expect him to be winning in the not too distant future. And then a couple of horses to mention that have got unchanged marks, and I think both have perhaps got targets further down the line in mind. The first is Go Dante. He was well beaten in the Welsh Champion Hurdle behind Lump Sum, but I thought it was very much a run that shaped like it was a run to bring him forward with his fitness. He was fairly weak in the market before the off. He travelled nicely through the race, but given that he is a horse that stays very strongly over this 2-mile trip when winning the Great Wood last season and again winning a handicap at Sandown, it was perhaps surprising to see him weaken up the home straight. Now, Ollie Murphy's horses are in very fine form, so you can't put it down to stable form. He was perhaps had a little bit left to work on. I think they're going to try and go back to the Great Wood, win that for the 2nd year in a row, off a £9 higher mark. Now, he did win off a mark of 129 at Sandown. In his final start last season, you might recall, he virtually refused to race at Aintree off a mark of 134 in that conditional jockeys race that closes the Aintree card. But he made really good progress. He only finished 5th in the end, but it was a pretty big run given how much ground he'd given away. That came off this mark of 134. If the rain gets into the ground now before the Great Wood, he's a horse that's definitely better on soft ground. I don't think a mark of 134 is beyond him, for all the fact that going into the Great Wood, there'll be a couple of very nicely handicapped horses coming out of novice ranks into handicap ranks that might just take a bit of beating. But I think a mark of 134 for Go Dante is still workable, and I wouldn't be too disappointed with that run in the Welsh Champion Hurdle. And the final horse to mention is Storminhome. He ran in the same race as Hurlerontheditch. He eventually finished 3rd. He was given a very patient ride by Keelan Woods. It was his first start for Dan Skelton, having received the horse from Ben Pauling, who lost the Megson horses last season. And I thought he travelled really nicely through the race, finished very strongly, which is actually an outlier to a number of Dan Skelton horses at the moment. I haven't really seen it mentioned, but I think it's worth pointing out that Dan Skelton, very fine trainer and normally operates at a decent strike rate, has dipped below 10%. He's just on 8% winners for runners for the last 2 weeks. And I've noticed a good few horses that, having travelled quite nicely through races, don't seem to have found an awful lot over the last 2 sort of furlongs or so. Could just be that the string are not quite firing at full fitness. The fact that Storminhome did run home very strongly, lived up to his name, I think suggests that run should perhaps be upgraded. And I think once the scouts have got a grasp on this horse, mark of 122 won't prove beyond him. And then just one final horse to mention that's got a new entry in the handicap ratings, and that's the Kemble Brewery. He was one of the 3 winners for Kim Bailey at Worcester. He's got an opening mark of 123, and quite interestingly, he's been given this mark off just 2 starts over hurdles. He won both his bumper starts. He was sent off odds-on favourite for a Cheltenham novice hurdle at the start of last season. He absolutely obliterated the first hurdle, very nearly got rid of David Bass, and his jumping confidence went to pot from there on inwards. The fact he was able to finish 3rd and behind Cannock Park, who's a decent performer on his day, I thought was testament to the horse. He returned with a big cut near his tendon, the trainer reported, so that was why he wasn't seen for the rest of the season, and it's very feasible to think that that cut might well have compromised his chance in that race as well. He's got a mark of 123. He won at Worcester. They went fairly slow early on and they really quickened down over the last few hurdles. The runner-up Duricon for David Pipe is very well regarded. And I think the fact that they went so quick over the final two hurdles and the Kemble Brewery's jumping past that test probably stands him in good stead as he now looks to go into handicap company. So a mark of 123 I think is lenient for a horse that's been held in very high regard by connections, and I'll be keen to see where they go with him next. And while we're on that race, horses that haven't yet got a handicap mark but I think are worth flagging, Jaccours and Hartington finished 4th and 5th. They're very much stayers in the making. They would not have been suited by the slowly run race at Worcester. They're certainly horses that might well pay to follow in novice hurdles over 2 miles 4 or further into the winter. So that's it for episode 2 of Miller's Movers. Slightly shorter episode this week with my Irish horses to follow and hopefully a few winners in the Handicap Movers and Shakers. I'll be back next week where I'll have a guest on again from the training ranks, a trainer that's doing great things at the moment. So be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss that. In the meantime, enjoy your week's racing and I'll see you same time next week.